The photograph slipped out of the folded flag when I lifted it, and the woman standing across from me went completely still. She was a retired colonel, 70-something, silver-haired, the kind of person who carries authority the way other people carry keys automatically, without thinking. She had been composed the entire afternoon, but the moment she saw that photograph, her composure left the room. She reached out, stopped herself, then looked at me directly for the first time since we'd been introduced. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away 6 weeks ago." She looked back down at the photo. A long pause. "What was his name?" "Raymond Earl Calloway." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted in her expression, not grief exactly, but the kind of recognition that comes when a name you thought you'd buried resurfaces without warning. "We need to speak privately," she said. "Not here." My grandfather Raymond was the kind of man most people looked through. He lived in a small house in Clarksburg, West Virginia, in a neighborhood where the porches sagged and the trucks in the driveways were older than the teenagers who drove them. He grew vegetables in the backyard. He kept a shortwave radio in the spare room that he listened to late at night with the door closed. He fixed things: clocks, lamps, an old reel-to-reel tape machine that nobody else in the family even knew the name of, and when he finished fixing them, he put them back where he found them without mentioning it. He didn't talk about the past. If you asked him about the war, he would refill your coffee cup and change the subject so smoothly that you forgot you'd asked at all. My mother, his daughter, had very little patience for him. To her, he was a problem that never resolved itself, financially unreliable, emotionally distant, perpetually mysterious in ways she found irritating rather than interesting. He had never held a job she could brag about. He had no pension she could point to, no title, no name recognition in any social circle she cared about. He drove a truck with a cracked dashboard and wore the same 4 flannel shirts on rotation, and when he showed up to holidays, my mother would smile tightly and steer conversations away from anything that risked making him the center of attention. My father was worse, in some ways. At least my mother's distance was consistent. My father's contempt came in, flashes of scoff at the dinner table, a rolled eye when Grandpa tried to tell a story, an implication carefully worded so it could always be denied. "Your grandfather means well," he used to say, which was the family's way of saying he had never amounted to anything. I was the exception. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because I was the youngest, or because I spent summers at his house while my parents worked. Whatever the reason, I knew my grandfather in a way the rest of my family never tried to. He taught me how to read topographic maps before I was 12. He taught me how to identify a plane by its engine sound. He once sat with me for 2 hours explaining how a single change in wind direction altered the outcome of a battle in Korea that most history books didn't mention. I asked him once how he knew so much about it. He smiled at his coffee cup. "I read a lot," he said. I was working at a county emergency management office in Virginia when I got the call from his neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Aldrich, who had his number in case of emergency. Grandpa had been found at the bottom of the steps in his kitchen. He had been there for most of the morning. I drove 4 hours that night. When I arrived at the hospital, the nurse at the desk told me I was the first family member who had come. My mother had called. She had asked about insurance coverage and whether he had listed anyone as next of kin. Then she had hung up. He was awake when I found his room, smaller than I remembered. Somehow the way people look when the furniture of their regular life gets stripped away and all that remains is the body in a bed. He turned his head when he heard my footsteps and his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You came," he said. "Of course I came," I told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother know you're here?" "She does now," I said. He nodded slowly, the way he always did when he was filing something away to think about later. "Don't be hard on her," he said. "She didn't know what to do with me. Most people didn't." I told him that wasn't an excuse. He looked out the window. "No," he said, "but it is a reason." Those were some of the last real words we had. He deteriorated over the following week infection, then the complications that follow infection in a man of 81 who has spent a lifetime refusing to see doctors. I sat with him as much as they would let me. My mother came once, on day 3, stayed for 40 minutes, and left before he woke up from a nap. My uncle sent a card. My father texted to ask whether there was a will. Grandpa died on a Wednesday morning, early, before the ward got loud. I was in the chair beside him. He didn't say anything at the end. He just stopped. I sat there for a long time before I called anyone. The funeral was my responsibility, which meant it was simple and honest and short. I rented a room at the funeral home in Clarksburg, bought flowers I could afford, and wrote a short piece myself because no one else volunteered. Mrs. Aldrich came. A man I didn't recognize, older, heavyset, wearing a VFW cap, sat in the back row and wept quietly into a paper handkerchief and left before I could speak to him. My uncle arrived late and left early. My mother sat beside me and stared at her hands throughout. My father didn't come. Busy with work, he said. My brother sent flowers. When I returned to Grandpa's house afterward to begin the long process of sorting his belongings, I moved through the rooms slowly, the way you do when you're looking for something you can't name. The kitchen was exactly as he'd left it, the coffee can by the percolator, a crossword half finished on the table, his reading glasses folded on top of it. The garden out back was already beginning to look untended. In the spare room, the one with the shortwave radio, I found it. Not in a drawer, not in a lockbox. It was in a plain manila envelope slipped between two books on the middle shelf, a dog-eared atlas, and a copy of a Korean English dictionary so worn the spine had been taped twice. Inside the envelope was a photograph, black and white, slightly water-stained at the corner. A group of men in civilian clothes, not uniforms, standing in front of what looked like a building with Cyrillic lettering above the door. 7 men. My grandfather was one of them. I recognized him immediately, even young, even in a coat that wasn't his, that same steady way he stood, weight balanced, eyes slightly ahead of wherever the camera was pointing. On the back, in his handwriting, Plovdiv, 1971, the ones who came home. I had no idea what it meant. I put it back in the envelope, set it on the kitchen table, and spent the rest of the afternoon going through closets and drawers the way families do when someone dies, making piles, making decisions, finding evidence of a life that was stranger and fuller than you ever took the time to notice. That night, I put the photograph in my jacket pocket. I don't know why. It just felt wrong to leave it. The Regional Emergency Preparedness Conference was something I had registered for months earlier, long before Grandpa got sick. I almost didn't go. But my supervisor reminded me it counted toward my continuing certification, and I was running low on reasons to stay in Clarksburg where everything reminded me of things I hadn't done. So I went. It was held at a government conference center 2 hours north, the kind of building that exists in a permanent state of fluorescent lighting and beige carpeting. Name tags, breakout sessions, a catered lunch that was neither good nor bad. I shook hands, introduced myself, sat through presentations about infrastructure resilience and mass casualty coordination. At the afternoon reception, I ended up near the back of the room beside a table of printed materials. No one was reading. I was checking my phone when someone joined me at the table and then stopped. I looked up. The woman was in her early 70s, straight-backed, dressed simply but precisely. She had the kind of face that doesn't waste expressions. She was looking not at me but at my jacket pocket, where the corner of the manila envelope had worked itself loose and the edge of the photograph was visible. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "I apologize," she said. I couldn't help but notice, "Is that a photograph?" Something in her tone made me pause. Not suspicious, exactly. More like there was a weight behind the question she wasn't ready to explain. I took it out and held it in a way that showed her the front without handing it over. Her expression changed entirely. Her name was Colonel Margaret Hess, retired. She had spent 31 years in defense intelligence. She told me this in a quiet corner of a hallway 30 feet from the reception, speaking in the careful, measured way of someone who has spent decades choosing words for a reason. She had known my grandfather, she said. Not personally, not socially, but she knew the photograph. "Where was this taken?" I asked. "Bulgaria," she said. "Plovdiv, 1971. I nodded. "That's what's written on the back. But I don't know what they were doing there." She studied me for a moment. "How much did your grandfather tell you about his service?" she asked. "Almost nothing," I said. "He mentioned Korea once. He said he spent time in Europe in the early 70s. That's everything." "That is probably everything he was permitted to say," she replied. "Permitted?" She folded her hands in front of her. "Your grandfather was not a conventional veteran," she said carefully. "He was attached to a civilian intelligence unit operating under State Department cover during the early Cold War period. The men in that photograph were part of a contact extraction network identifying and relocating individuals whose safety was compromised by Soviet intelligence activity in Eastern Europe. I stood very still. "He was intelligence?" I said. "In the broadest sense," she replied. "His unit had no official designation. If something went wrong, there was no acknowledgement, no record, no assistance." She paused. "Most of the men in that photograph lived the rest of their lives the same way your grandfather did, quietly, and without explanation." "He died quietly," I said. "And without much company." Something moved across her face. "I know," she said. "And I'm sorry for that. I didn't sleep that night." I lay in the conference center hotel room with the photograph on the nightstand and my grandfather's whole life rearranging itself in my memory. The shortwave radio, the Korean English dictionary, the way he could read a topographic map, the locked door on the spare room when I was little never locked when I was older, as if the things behind it had finally been made safe by time. The way he always seemed faintly, carefully alone. I thought about all the holidays where my mother steered the conversation away from him, all the dinners where my father made his feelings known through timing and silence, all the years we treated his reticence as a character flaw instead of a condition of employment. He had been carrying something that had no name and no paperwork and no ceremony. And we had handed him a plate of food and asked if he needed directions home. Colonel Hess gave me her number before she left the conference. She said she wanted to make a few calls. First, there were people she knew who might be willing to speak with me, people who had served in adjacent capacities during the same period. A week later, she called back. She had found 2 men, both in their 80s, both willing to meet. One was in Ohio, one was in Maryland. Neither had ever spoken publicly about this. We met in Ohio first, at a VFW post in a small city I had never heard of. The man's name was Frank Dorlow, and he had the handshake of someone who had spent decades reminding himself to be gentle with it. He recognized the photograph immediately. He pointed to himself second from the left and then to my grandfather. "Ray," he said quietly. "I haven't heard that name in a long time." "He never talked about it," I said. Frank nodded as if this were obvious. "None of us did," he said. "That was the deal you made going in. You came home and you disappeared." He looked at the photograph. "Some of us disappeared better than others. What did they do?" I asked. Specifically. He was quiet for a long moment. "There were people behind the Iron Curtain who were working with Western intelligence," he said finally. "Scientists, bureaucrats, military officers who had doubts about where things were going. When their cover was at risk, someone had to go get them out. No uniforms, no official presence. Just people with languages and nerve and the ability to look like they belonged somewhere they didn't." He looked up at me. "Your grandfather spoke 4 languages. Did you know that?" I did not know that. "He was very calm," Frank said. "Under pressure, I mean. The kind of calm that isn't about being fearless. It's about having already decided that the outcome is not the point." He paused. "The people he helped, some of them are still alive. Some of their children are still alive. They have no idea who he was." "He never told my family any of this," I said. Frank looked at me gently. "He couldn't," he said. "Not legally, for a long time. And then, after enough years, telling would have meant explaining why he hadn't told. And I think he decided that was a conversation that would cost more than it was worth." I thought about my mother, about my father. I thought about cost. I drove back to my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon without calling first. My mother was in the kitchen. My father was watching something in the living room. My brother, who happened to be visiting, was at the kitchen table on his laptop. They all looked mildly surprised to see me, and slightly braced for a reason. I put the photograph on the kitchen table. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. My mother leaned over and looked at it. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In Grandpa's spare room, between 2 books." She straightened up. "It's just an old photo," she said. "He had lots of odd things like that." "It's not odd," I said. "It was taken in Bulgaria in 1971. Grandpa was part of a unit that extracted intelligence assets out of Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. That's what he was doing when you thought he was being evasive. That's what he was protecting when you thought he was just being difficult." My father came in from the other room. "What's going on?" he asked. "I'm telling you who Grandpa was," I said. There was a silence. "You talked to someone?" my mother asked. "A retired defense intelligence colonel, and a man who served in the same unit." And I have a second meeting next week with another one. I held her gaze. He saved people's lives. People who are alive today because of decisions he made in places he was never allowed to tell you about. My father frowned. If any of this were true, he said slowly, you'd think there would be some record of it. That was the entire point, I said. There wasn't supposed to be. Nobody said anything for a long moment. My brother closed his laptop. My mother picked up the photograph and looked at it for the first time with something other than dismissal. Her eyes moved across the faces. She found my grandfather, held the image there. He looks young, she said quietly. He was, I said. He was younger than I am now. She set the photograph down very carefully, as if it had become something breakable. My father sat down at the table. He tried to tell me something once, he said. He didn't look at me when he said it. He was looking at the table. When you were small, he started to say something about his time overseas and He stopped. I told him we were tired of the old war stories. A pause. He never brought it up again. The kitchen was very quiet. I thought he was making himself important, my father said. I thought it was a story. It wasn't a story, I said. He nodded once. My mother wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, quickly, as if she hoped no one would notice. He died alone, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something more honest than an accusation. It was admission. Yes, I said. He did. My brother was the one who finally spoke. What do we do now? He asked. Colonel Hess helped us with the next part. She knew people at the Veterans History Project, a program through the Library of Congress that documents oral testimonies from veterans, including those whose service exists in categories that don't fit the standard forms. It wasn't classified disclosure. It was something smaller and more permanent, a recorded account that would sit in an archive and tell the truth about a life in a language that didn't require a security clearance to believe. We gathered what we could. The photograph. 3 letters Frank Durlew agreed to write on record. A brief written statement from Colonel Hess about the operational context. The atlas with my grandfather's handwriting in the margins, coordinates, dates, small cryptic notes that Frank helped us decode over 2 long phone calls. My father sat through all of it. He didn't say much, but he was there. My mother started asking questions, careful ones, the kind that take practice to form, that require you to first admit you never ask. She called Frank twice herself. The second time, they spoke for over an hour. We held a second gathering. Not a funeral, he'd already had one of those. Small and plain and attended by people who didn't know the half of it. This was something different. We invited Mrs. Aldrich. We invited Frank, who drove 6 hours without being asked twice. We invited the man from the back row at the original service. It took some work to find him, but Mrs. Aldrich remembered his face, and my brother tracked him down through the VFW, and his name turned out to be Glenn Murchison, and he had served alongside my grandfather in Plovdiv in the winter of 1971, in a situation he would describe only as the worst 3 days of my life, and the reason I'm still here to have a life. We met at my grandfather's house, which the estate had not yet transferred. We sat in the living room and in the kitchen, and out on the back porch where the garden was finally being tended again. I had taken it over, which felt like the least I could do. Glenn Murchison stood at the edge of the yard for a long time, looking at the vegetable beds. He always said he was going to grow things when it was over, Glenn said. He used to talk about a garden. He had it for 30 years. I told him. Glenn smiled at the ground. Good, he said. I came across a notebook in the second round of sorting a thin composition book, spiral-bound, tucked inside the back cover of the Korean English dictionary I had kept. I had missed it the first time. Inside, in my grandfather's careful print, were entries that were neither journal nor log. They were more like observations, short paragraphs, dates, but no years. Descriptions of weather, of light, of the way a city smelled at 6 a.m. in winter. Between some entries, in a smaller hand, single lines that were clearly not about the weather at all. Confirmed safe, family intact, purpose sufficient. Lost the thread for a while. Found it again. She asked why I seemed sad. I said I wasn't. I was just thinking. That was true. I was thinking about whether the people you help ever know you helped them. I decided it doesn't matter. It matters a little. I read the notebook 3 times. Then I read it to my mother over the phone. She didn't say anything for a long time after. Then she said, "He sounds lonely." He was, I said, but he chose it. That doesn't make it okay, she said. No, I agreed. It doesn't. But I think he made peace with it in a way that had nothing to do with whether we were there. A longer silence. I wasn't there, she said. I know. I should have been. Yes, I said. You should have. She cried then. Not the contained, managed kind. The other kind. I let it go on. After a while, she said, I keep trying to figure out when I stopped asking about him. I don't think there was a single moment, I said. I think it was a lot of small ones. That's worse, she said. It is, I agreed. And it's also more fixable. Not with him, but going forward. Colonel Hess retired from consulting work the following spring. She sent me a note about it, and at the end she wrote something I've turned over many times since. Your grandfather once told me, early in his career, that the goal was to do the work and then get out of the way of the work. He believed that the best outcomes were the ones you never got to see, the life that continued quietly somewhere because of a decision made in a cold building in a city you'd never be able to say you visited. I don't know if that philosophy brought him peace, but I know it was genuine. He believed in the work more than he believed in the acknowledgement, which is rarer than it sounds. Please take care of the garden. He would have liked knowing someone was. I folded the note and put it with the photograph and the notebook in a wooden box I'd bought for the purpose. Not a memorial exactly, more like a record. The kind that doesn't need an audience to be real. My father asks about the garden sometimes when we talk on the phone. He has started calling more. Not often, we're not built for that kind of frequency, our family, but more than before. He asks whether the tomatoes came in. He asks what Grandpa used to do about the late-season frost. I tell him what I know, which is more than he expects and less than there is. My mother drove to Clarksburg on her own last October. I didn't know she was going until she called me from the driveway. She said she just wanted to see it. I said I'd meet her there. We walked through the empty rooms together. The new owners hadn't moved in yet, and the house still held its shape, still smelled faintly of the particular combination of coffee and motor oil and old paper that meant him. She stood in the doorway of the spare room for a long time, looking at the shelf where the radio had been. He sat in here at night, she said. I used to think he was hiding. He probably was, I said, but not from us, from the noise. She touched the empty shelf. I never asked him what he listened to, she said. I did once, I said. He said, everything, news, weather, people talking. He said you could learn a lot about the world from what it sounds like when it thinks no one is listening. She stood there for another minute. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen, and I followed her. We made coffee in a pot I'd brought, using the same percolator I'd taken when we closed the house, because it seemed wrong to leave it for strangers. We sat at the table where the crossword had been half finished, and we drank it, and we didn't need to talk very much. That is, I've decided, its own kind of inheritance. I still carry the photograph. Not every day, but when I travel for worksite assessments, field exercises, the kind of tasks that take you to places where you're responsible for things going right in ways most people will never know about, I put it in my bag. The 7 men in civilian clothes, standing in front of a building in Plovdiv, 1971, the ones who came home. My grandfather stands slightly apart from the others, the way he always stood, looking not quite at the camera, already somehow calculating the distance to the exit. He left no great monument, no commendation, no public record of what he gave to a country that officially asked nothing of him, because officially he was never there. What he left was smaller and harder to measure. A garden that still grows. A notebook with handwriting in the margins. A photograph that one person carried without knowing why, until someone else recognized it in a hallway, and the whole shape of a life shifted into focus. And a lesson I am still learning, that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones holding the most. That dignity does not always announce itself. That love sometimes looks exactly like showing up, over and over, without requiring that anyone name what you are doing. My family is not transformed. Transformation in real life is slow and incomplete, and regularly interrupted by ordinary selfishness. But we are paying attention differently. My brother calls my mother more. My father has started going to the local veterans center on Tuesday mornings, where he sits and listens to men talk about things they mostly don't talk about, and comes home quieter than he left. I tend the garden when I'm in Clarksburg. I'm not as good at it as he was. The rows aren't as straight. I forget things and lose track of the season. But I show up. And sometimes that is the whole of it, just showing up, doing the work, getting out of the way of the work, trusting that the outcome will matter to someone somewhere even if you're never in the room when it does. My grandfather knew that. He knew it long before I was born, in a cold building in a city I've never visited, standing next to men whose names I'm only now learning. He carried it for 60 years without asking us to carry it with him. The least I can do is make sure it doesn't stop here.